So finally, I'm not discussing any, current related topic or anything. I'm just want to discuss about this concept of or this perspective, which is subaltern perspective or subalternity. Because this is something that we usually do not cover in the class, right? You may not have come across about subalternity I think in books also, it is not widely available. So I just thought I'll just discuss about subaltern perspective a bit. So what according to you is subaltern perspective? Okay, we are viewing things from the perspective of marginalized sections of society. Okay, any other explanation? See, basically, when it comes to subaltern perspective, the initial level of discussion of this perspective actually was related to that of the colonial history and stuff. Because when it comes to the colonial history of our country, we were dealing with that history from the viewpoint of elites, right? In the sense, when it comes to that of the nationalist elites, they were all the middle class intelligentsia who have got foreign education, right? When it comes to that of the moderate phase of Indian National Congress, it was also largely consisting of various elites, educated elites, business elites, right? In the later stages of our freedom movement also, these elites had a larger control over the freedom process, as well as their role was actually highlighted in the all historical notes and textbooks. But at the same time, the common people, especially the disadvantaged section or deprived sections or marginalized sections of population, have also actively participated in these movements, right? But history never consider their contribution to the level at which they give consideration for the contribution of the elites. This is how that subaltern perspective initially emerged or discussed. Right? We need to consider history not just from the perspective of elites, we have to also consider the contribution of different sections of population, especially the marginalized sections of population. Right? Now, they quote the various rebellions and movements like, say, for example, Santal Rebellion. We learn about it, but again, it is not given much importance. When it comes to that of the Quit India movement, we say that it is the movement of masses because leaders were not there. It is a leaderless movement, but these movements were carried out by the common people, marginalized sections of population. Right? We just mention it as the movement of the masses. So, subaltern perspective initially tried to give or to understand history not just from the perspective of the elites, but also from the perspective of the non-elites, especially of the marginalized sections of population. Then, subaltern perspective also tried to view various social issues from the perspective of the marginalized sections. Clear? So, the starting point of understanding subalternity is by understanding the contribution of the marginalized sections and the common people and how their role in the colonial history was neglected, especially when it comes to our freedom struggle. Clear? Also, when it comes to that of the subaltern or the marginalized sections, it means those people who are marginalized as well as are ignored by the system. Because when it comes to subaltern perspective, they say that the marginalized sections of population are not given any kind of recognition, or they are not given any attention even by the state. State does not act for the promotion of well-being of these sections. State largely operate against the interest of the marginalized sections. This is another important viewpoint of the subaltern perspective. So first, we have mentioned about the role, historiography and stuff. Second, we have to also consider how the state ignores the marginalized section of population, how state usually act against the interest of the marginalized sections of population. All right. Then, according to Guha, explains that the subordination cannot be understood except as one of the constitutive terms in a binary relationship of which the other is dominance. See, when it comes to subaltern perspective, they say that in the society, there is a binary relationship. And this binary relationship is also to two extremes. One is that of dominance, the other one is subordination. The subaltern perspective deals with or tries to address the issues of those who are subordinated. Because according to the subaltern perspective, the marginalized sections of population are always under the dominance of the elites, even if they try to resist it. The kind of domination or dominance that these groups have, the elites have, cannot be resisted by the subaltern or the marginalized section. Okay, let's take the example of Ambedkar. Ambedkar tried to, resist the caste inequalities in the society, right? They tried to fight against it, but at the end, what happened was Ambedkar said it is not possible to fight against the caste system by being within the Hindu system because it can never be fixed. Right. So even against the resistance of the marginalized sections, the dominance of the elites are forced on them. So this is how subaltern perspective view marginalization and exploitation in the society. Is it clear? Okay. Now, why do we need a subaltern historiography? It is because the current historiography that we follow does not address the contribution of the marginalized sections. See, one thing that we need to understand here is the elitist historiography leaves out the autonomous domain. Now, this autonomous domain means it is pointing to the marginalized population. Now, why are they referred to as autonomous domain? It is because, according to the subaltern perspective, this marginalized population did not participate in the freedom struggle because of the leadership of the elite groups, or they did not participate in this freedom struggle based on the guidance and direction received from that of the elite groups. Instead, they participated in these struggles, in this process on their own, independent of the existence of the elite group. But our historiography or the current history of colonial past of India does not recognize this independent participation of the marginalized sections. Because mostly when we depict marginalized sections' participation in the movements, it will be based on the leadership and guidance of the elite groups. Right? See, whenever we say Gandhi's role in India's freedom struggle, we say that Gandhi was able to bring the marginalized sections of society into the freedom struggle. There again, we are connecting their participation with that of an elite individual or the elite group. This is what they challenge. Is it clear? Okay. Now, UPSC may also ask about that of various mobilization of subaltern groups, various levels of mobilization. So I just wanted to give some examples for that. See, whenever we discuss about the Dalit movements, right, that is an example for subaltern movement. So caste-related movements, especially with the start of B.R. Ambedkar, or even you can mention about SNDP movement, self-respect movement, all these movements that we have learned in the history, these are all examples of subaltern mobilization. Because these mobilization were not dependent on the elite groups. It was independent of them, and they were conscious of their identity as well as they were conscious of their needs. Right? And they were trying to overcome the dominance of the elite ideology as well. Because whenever it comes to subaltern mobilization, you need to understand that the purpose of it is to counter the elite dominance, counter the dominant ideology of the society. Right? After independence, we can also mention about that of Dalit Panther movements. Again, they tried to counter the dominance of the elites, that they tried to counter the dominant ideology of society. So all the mobilization against the dominant ideology or ideas which are creation of the elites in the society are all examples of subaltern mobilization. Clear? So all movements, all mobilization, which is to counter the dominant ideology or ideas in the society, which is a creation of the elites, can be classified or can be considered as example of subaltern mobilization. So Dalit mobilization, Dalit Panther movement. When it comes to that of Chipko movement, it can again be considered as an example of subaltern mobilization because it was against the dominant ideology. It was to counter the elites, right? Various tribal movements. You can even mention about that of Vedanta issue, right? That is also a subaltern mobilization because they were countering the dominant group, the elite group. Bodhan movement cannot be considered as part of the subaltern perspective because Acharya Vinoba Bhave cannot be considered as someone who comes from a marginalized section. Right. So all that again is from a Gandhian philosophy perspective, which is the elitist and the dominant ideology, right? So everything that counter that kind of a dominant ideas or dominant ideology, which is of elite origin, that can be considered as part of subaltern perspective. Phule, you can mention. Okay. Because when it comes to Phule's, it was also against the dominant ideas, dominant ideology. So now the peasant movements against, contract farming or corporate farming, all those movements that is to counter these kind of influences, elite influences, can be mentioned as example for that. Tribal movements, Dalit movements, movements by women, right? Then, as we have also mentioned, you can peasant movements. These are all examples of that. Clear? LGBTQ movement can also be considered because it is again against, because it is not, absolutely from, you can mention it because it is again marginalized section. They are countering the dominant narrative. Right, so you can mention. See, marginality cannot be considered only through a single perspective of class. Marginality can also be based on caste, one's gender, right? So you can consider different types of marginality there. Even though, those belonging to the upper class or middle class may be present in such movements, still they can be considered as marginalized because of the marginalization they face when it comes to gender. So LGBTQ movements can also be considered as an example of this perspective. Okay. Is it clear? So this is how you need to understand subaltern perspective. Any doubts, anyone, related to the concepts that we have discussed? Any doubt? Okay. Naxalism, it's not a subaltern movement. It's rather a political ideology, right? So we cannot consider it as a... They claim to represent the needs of the marginalized sections, but it is of a different nature. You can mention that. See, peasant movements in India can be mentioned as an example of subaltern mobilization because these peasants are mobilizing against the dominant narrative created by... That can also be done by the state. So all those movements against the state also, if it is to counter the dominant narrative and, so all those stuff, that can be considered as part of the subaltern. The environmental movements, especially by the tribal population, mostly they are getting in conflict with the state itself or the companies which are awarded such kind of, exploration licenses in such areas. So indirectly also they are against the state itself, right? So these are all examples of subaltern movements. Yeah. See, Medapatka's this movement is also in certain, articles I've seen that they have taken that as an example because mostly the participation is coming from those who are affected, those who want to, counter that kind of a, plan, right, which is of elite nature. So even though the leadership comes from somewhat an elite background also, but what they are representing, right, what they are countering also matters. So in certain materials, I've seen that, this Narmada Bachao Andolan is also considered as a type of or an example of subaltern mobilization. Yeah. Clear.